The second, the judge's gavel hit the wood. Richard Blackwell pulled out his phone, tapped 3 buttons, and smiled at his ex-wife, like a man who had just won a war. Emily Carter watched every joint account disappear from her screen in real time. Every credit card. Gone. The apartment keys already changed. He leaned close and whispered, "You only had this life because I gave it to you." The courtroom was silent, and Emily said nothing, because Richard had no idea that 3 weeks earlier she had already made a phone call that would change everything. Subscribe to our channel, follow Emily's story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Emily Carter had learned very early in her marriage that the most dangerous thing a woman could do in a room full of powerful men was to appear smarter than they expected. So she stopped. She stopped asking questions at board dinners. She stopped correcting numbers in conversations when Richard got them wrong. She stopped finishing sentences when she realized the men in the room were already looking past her, waiting for Richard to speak again. She learned how to smile at exactly the right moment, how to laugh one beat after the joke landed, how to hold a glass of champagne for 2 hours without ever taking more than 3 sips so she could stay sharp while everyone around her grew loose. That was the performance, and for 10 years it worked. But the night before the divorce was finalized, Emily sat alone in the hotel room she had been quietly renting for 3 weeks under a name Richard's people would not recognize, and she did not sleep. She sat at the edge of the bed and thought about the morning her mother called her 6 years ago, crying, saying she could not pay her medical bills. Emily had gone to Richard that same evening, and Richard had looked at her across the dinner table, set down his fork carefully, and said without any particular emotion, "I'll handle it. But Emily learned to manage your requests better. You come to me with problems, not solutions." She remembered sitting there looking at the man she had married, and something inside her shifted. Not dramatically, not with tears or anger or raised voices, just a quiet internal shift. The kind that happens when you realize for the first time, clearly and completely, that the person sitting across from you does not see you as a partner. He sees you as a category, a slot to fill, a role to manage. She had smiled at him that night. "You're right," she said. "I'll do better." And she did, just not in the way he expected. The morning of the divorce, Emily wore a gray suit she had bought 2 weeks earlier from a mid-range department store on the west side of Manhattan. Not because she could not afford better, but because Richard's private investigator had been photographing her, and she needed the photographs to look exactly like what Richard wanted to see. A woman struggling, a woman reduced, a woman who had already accepted her defeat before the judge even opened his mouth. The courtroom smelled like old wood and recycled air. Richard's legal team sat on the left side, 4 of them in matching charcoal suits, their briefcases stacked with counter-arguments, property assessments, and pre-signed financial documents. Emily's lawyer, a quiet woman named Diane Salter, who had once worked in corporate law before transitioning into family practice, sat on the right side with 2 folders. Just 2. Richard had laughed when his people showed him the photos of Emily's new lawyer. She hired a downgrade, he had told his lead attorney, Marcus Webb. A woman who used to work in corporate, small practice, low profile. Emily really doesn't understand how this works. Marcus had nodded. It appears she doesn't. But Marcus had not done what Emily's people had done 3 weeks before the filing date. He had not gone back through 6 years of financial disclosures, land transfer documents, and investment agreements for a 47-acre development project on the eastern waterfront. He had not noticed the 12-page rider attached to the original Blackwell Harbor development approval that contained a clause so small it was printed in 10-point font on page 9, a clause that Richard's own legal team had apparently never read carefully enough to understand what it meant when paired with the most recent coastal development regulations introduced by the state legislature 14 months ago. Emily knew about the clause. She had known about it for 6 years. She had read it on a Tuesday morning while Richard was in a conference call sitting at the desk in the home office he never locked because he never believed she would go in. She had not photocopied it. She had not taken photographs. She had simply read it, stood up, walked to the kitchen, made herself a cup of tea, and filed it inside the part of her mind where she stored things she was not ready to use yet. The divorce proceedings lasted 48 minutes. Richard's team had been thorough. The property settlements were structured so that Emily received a buyout figure that was on paper generous enough to appear fair, but had been calculated to leave her without any ongoing ownership in any of Blackwell Holdings' core assets. The apartment Richard's legal team argued was registered under a holding company that predated the marriage. The investment accounts were structured through a separate trust. The joint checking and savings accounts were, of course, the simplest to control. Emily's lawyer, Diane, raised 3 points, all of which Richard's team had prepared for. She accepted the counter-arguments without dramatic protest. Richard's lead attorney, Marcus, watched Diane's quiet responses with the satisfied expression of a man whose team had already calculated every possible chess move and found none of them threatening. The judge finalized the divorce at 11:47 in the morning. Richard straightened his jacket, looked across at Emily, and reached for his phone. He typed 4 numbers into a secure interface his financial team had prepared specifically for this moment. It was his people had assured him elegant, clean, simultaneous. Every account, every card, every financial tool Emily had access to through their shared financial network would go dark at the same instant the divorce was finalized. He had wanted it to happen in the courthouse. He had wanted her to feel it while he was still in the room. He had wanted to watch her face. He pressed the button, then he looked up, and he smiled at her. Emily looked down at her phone. She opened her banking application. The joint checking account showed a 0 balance with a frozen notice. The shared savings account was locked. The secondary credit card showed declined and suspended. She did not gasp. She did not reach for Diane's arm. She simply stood there reading the screen, and her expression was exactly what Richard had imagined it would be. Blank. Still. Absorbed. He stepped close to her in the narrow aisle between the courtroom seats, close enough that his voice did not need to carry past the two of them. "Check your accounts," he said. "I already did," she replied. "Then you understand." He looked at her for a moment longer, waiting for something to crack in her face, waiting for the moment when the reality of what he had done would show itself in her eyes. And it did not come. Her expression stayed still, like a lake on a day with no wind. "You always forget one thing, Emily," he said. "You only had this life because I gave it to you." Emily looked at him. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she said simply, "I know you believe that." And she walked out of the courtroom. Richard watched her go and felt for the first time a flicker of something he immediately dismissed. Not because he recognized it for what it was, which was unease, but because he was Richard Blackwell, and Richard Blackwell did not feel unease. He felt momentum. He felt forward motion. He felt the comfortable weight of a man who had just closed a chapter and could already see the next one waiting cleanly ahead. He walked out of the courthouse with Marcus on his left and his personal assistant Joel on his right, and the car was already waiting at the curb, and the afternoon was full and scheduled, and by the time the car pulled into traffic, Richard had moved on completely. That was the last time he would feel certain about anything for a very long time. Emily took the subway. Not the downtown express that would have dropped her closest to the hotel, but the longer local line that stopped 7 more times and took 26 extra minutes. She sat in a window seat with her bag on her lap and her phone face down against her thigh, and she watched the stations move past, and she breathed. She had been planning for this day for 2 years, not revenge. She had thought about that word carefully, turned it over many times, and decided it was the wrong container for what she was doing. Revenge was emotional. Revenge was about the past. What Emily had been building was about the future, her future, and the fact that Richard's future would also be affected by it was simply a consequence of the choices he had made over the course of many years. Choices she had watched carefully and documented quietly and understood more deeply than any of the people he actually paid to understand them. Her phone buzzed. A text from a contact saved under the name NH. It read, "Phase 2 confirmed. Call when ready." Emily looked at the message for a long moment. Then she put her phone back face down on her thigh and watched the next station go past. She was not ready yet. She needed 24 hours. She needed to let Richard's team believe they had won completely. She needed the performance to hold for one more day. The hotel room was small. The desk faced a window that looked into the side wall of the building next door, which Emily had chosen specifically because it meant no one could photograph her from outside. She had bought the room with a prepaid card under the name of a holding company that had no connection to anything Richard's investigators would recognize. She sat at the desk, opened her laptop, and made 2 calls. The first was to Nathan Hayes. Nathan was not a dramatic man. He was 53 years old, had worked in financial risk analysis for 28 years, wore the same brand of reading glasses he had worn since his 40s, and spoke in a tone that was so measured and even that people sometimes underestimated how much he was saying. Emily had met him at a charity event 4 years into her marriage, one of those fundraising dinners where the tables cost $30,000 and nobody actually spoke to anyone outside their industry circle. Richard had been holding court at the center of the room, and Emily had drifted to the edge of a conversation between three people she did not know, and Nathan had been one of them. He had asked her a question about a development project that was being discussed in one of the financial newspapers that week. Not a social question, a real question. He had looked directly at her and waited for her answer as if he actually expected she would have one. She had. His expression when she finished speaking had been the expression of a man recalibrating. Not dramatically, not obviously, but she had caught it, the small narrowing of the eyes, the slight adjustment in posture, the moment when he decided she was someone worth talking to. They had spoken for 14 minutes at that dinner. Then Richard had appeared at her shoulder, placed a hand on the small of her back, and gently, smoothly redirected her attention away. Nathan had watched that moment. He had said nothing, but he had given her his card. She had kept it for 2 years before she used it, and when she finally called him, she had called from a phone she bought with cash at a convenience store in New Jersey, and she had driven 40 minutes from the city to make the call, and she had told him exactly enough of the truth to see whether he would listen. He had listened. That had been 18 months before the divorce. Now Emily sat in the hotel room and said to him, "It's done." Nathan was quiet for a moment. How did he handle it? Exactly the way I expected. The accounts are frozen. Yes. Nathan was quiet again. Then he said, "You know this changes the timing." "I know. He'll be watching every move you make for the next 30 days. "I know that too. So we move carefully." "We've always moved carefully," Emily said. "That hasn't changed." She heard him exhale slowly. "I've been doing this for almost 3 decades, Emily. I want you to understand what I'm saying when I tell you that what you've assembled here is extraordinary. The documentation, the timing, the understanding of how these structures interact with each other. This is not something a person assembles by accident." "I know," she said again. "Are you ready for what comes next?" She looked at the wall across from the desk. "I've been ready for 2 years." "Then we begin tomorrow." She ended the call. The second call was to her mother. Her mother's name was Jean Carter, and she was 71 years old and lived in a small house outside Philadelphia that Emily had arranged to have refinanced 3 months before the divorce through a completely separate financial structure that Richard's team had never identified. Jean Carter did not know the full story. She knew that Emily was divorcing Richard. She knew that Emily had been planning carefully. She knew that Emily was going to be fine. But she did not know the details because Emily had decided early on that the fewer people who held the complete picture, the safer the picture was. "Baby," her mother said when she answered, "how did it go?" "It went the way it was supposed to," Emily said. Her mother was silent for a moment. "Are you all right?" Emily thought about that question. She thought about what it meant to be all right in a situation like this, in the aftermath of a marriage ending in the quiet of a hotel room in a city that had watched her stand next to a powerful man for a decade and had never really looked at her. She thought about the 1147 finalization and the frozen accounts, and Richard's voice saying, "You only had this life because I gave it to you," and the expression on his face when he pressed that button, the satisfied, comfortable, already moving on expression of a man who had never once been wrong about anything. "Yes," she said. "I'm all right." Her mother exhaled. "Come home when this is finished, even for just a few days." "I will," Emily said. "I promise." She hung up the phone. Then she sat in the quiet of the hotel room and let herself feel for the first time that day the full weight of what was happening. Not fear. She had moved through fear 18 months ago when she first understood the scope of what she was building and the risk it carried. Not anger. She had processed anger in smaller increments over the years each time Richard had walked past her in a room full of people and introduced her as "my wife Emily," with the emphasis on "my" rather than on her name. Not sadness exactly, though there was something under the surface that resembled grief. Grief for the person she had been when she married him, the younger woman who had believed that intelligence and loyalty and hard work were enough to build a partnership with another person. What she felt sitting in that hotel room on the night her marriage ended was clarity, the specific, clean, almost physical sensation of clarity. She knew exactly what was about to happen. She knew exactly when it would begin. She knew exactly what the outcome would be when all the pieces finally moved into their final positions. And she also knew, and this was the part she had not told. Nathan had not told her mother, had not written in any document or spoken into any phone, that none of it was going to feel the way she had imagined it would feel. Because the truth about the plan she had spent 2 years building was that it had never been about Richard. Not really. It had been about her, about proving to herself in the clearest possible terms that the quiet woman who stood beside a powerful man for 10 years had not lost herself in the process. That the years of managing her own intelligence, calibrating her own voice, choosing her silences with such careful precision, none of it had cost her the core of who she was. That it was all still there, intact, ready waiting. She closed the laptop. She turned off the lamp. And in the dark, for the first time in 2 years, Emily Carter slept without dreaming. The next morning, Richard arrived at Blackwell Holdings headquarters at 7:15, which was early even for him. He rode the elevator to the 42nd floor, walked through the glass-walled executive corridor, and settled into the morning briefing with his senior leadership team with the focused energy of a man closing in on the final phase of a project he had been managing very carefully for a very long time. The harbor development was the centerpiece. The Blackwell Harbor Development, 47 acres of eastern waterfront property, projected development cost of $380 million, pre-sale agreements already signed with 7 major institutional investors, construction timeline set to begin in 8 months. It was the largest single project in Blackwell Holdings history, and it was scheduled to become the defining statement of Richard's career. The development that would move him from successful to legendary. The project that would make people stop speaking his name alongside other businessmen and start speaking it alone. He had been working toward this for 7 years. The morning briefing covered the usual ground investor updates, construction timeline confirmations, regulatory compliance updates, and Richard moved through it with the confident efficiency of a man who had already reviewed everything before the meeting started. His team spoke, he responded, the meeting moved. At the end of the briefing, his head of investor relations, a careful man named Stephen Park, raised one item. "We got an inquiry yesterday afternoon from 2 of the institutional groups," Stephen said, "Belmore Capital and the Whitford Group." Richard looked at him. "What kind of inquiry?" "They want to schedule a call. They described it as a routine checkpoint on the harbor project." "Schedule it," Richard said. "This week or next?" "They specifically asked for before Thursday." Richard held Stephen's gaze for a moment. "Fine. Set it for Wednesday." He did not think more about it. Investor checkpoints were normal. Belmore and Whitford were 2 of his most established partners' relationships that went back 12 and 9 years respectively. Calls like this happened. They were simply part of the business. He moved through the rest of his morning with the same smooth efficiency as always. It was not until Tuesday evening, when Stephen Park appeared at the door of Richard's office 40 minutes after the building had largely emptied out, that Richard felt for the second time that brief and unfamiliar flicker. "Richard," Stephen said. He was holding a folder. His expression was the expression of a man carrying something he would rather not carry. "Something came through this afternoon that I think you need to see." Richard looked up from his desk. "What is it?" Stephen walked in and set the folder on the desk without opening it. "It's a report, a financial risk assessment. It came through a third-party distribution channel. Legal is already looking at it." "A risk assessment on what?" Stephen met his eyes. "On Blackwell Harbor." Richard looked at the folder for a long moment, then he opened it. The report was 43 pages. It was written with the clean technical precision of someone who understood exactly what they were describing. Not a journalist, not a regulator, but someone with deep and specific knowledge of how the project's financial structure worked. It identified 3 areas of concern in the harbor development, with a clarity that made Richard's chest tighten as he read the incomplete land approval on the southeastern parcel, which was 28 acres of the 47. A series of financial exposure points in the subsidiary structure that would create cascading liability if the project timeline shifted. And a clause in the original coastal development approval that, when read in conjunction with the state legislature's 14-month-old coastal protection amendments, created a regulatory conflict that could freeze the entire project pending review. Richard read the report twice. When he finished the second reading, he set it down on his desk and looked at the far wall. "Who sent this?" he asked. "It came through a financial research distribution network," Stephen said. "The author is listed as a consulting firm called Crestline Risk Partners. Legal can't find any prior registration for that firm name. It appears to be a new entity." Richard was quiet for a moment. "And Belmore and Whitford?" "They received copies this afternoon," Stephen confirmed. "About 2 hours before they sent the inquiry requesting Wednesday's call." Richard sat very still. His mind moved through the list of people who had deep enough knowledge of Blackwell Harbor's internal structure to produce a document this specific. His legal team, his financial team, his senior project managers, a handful of external consultants who had been involved in the early development stages, and one other person, a person who had sat beside him for 10 years, a person who had been present at dinners where this project was discussed, a person who had access to the home office he had never thought to lock because he had never once imagined she would go in. "Stephen," Richard said, his voice very quiet. "Yes. Get me everything you can find on Crestline Risk Partners, and get me the name of every person Emily has had contact with in the past 18 months. Stephen looked at him. "Everything," Richard said. Stephen picked up the folder and walked out. Richard sat at his desk in the near-empty office and stared at the 43rd floor of the building across the street and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt exposed. He had frozen her accounts to make her small. He had genuinely, completely not considered that she might have already spent the previous 2 years doing something that could make him smaller. He picked up his phone. He called her number. It rang 3 times. Emily answered on the 4th ring. "Richard," she said. Her voice was neutral, calm, the voice of someone who had slept well. "Emily." He kept his own voice level, controlled. "There's a report circulating about the harbor project." She said nothing. "I need to know," he said, and even as he said it, he was aware of something strange in his own voice, something that had not been there in the courthouse yesterday, a different quality, not anger, not command, but something quieter and more uncertain. "Did you have anything to do with this?" Emily said. "I think the better question, Richard, is how a report this specific about your own project is even possible. What does that tell you?" He said, "Don't play that with me." "I'm not playing anything," she said. "Emily." "Richard." Her voice was patient, almost gentle. "You froze every account I had access to the second the divorce was finalized. You arranged it in advance. You planned it so it would happen in the courthouse so you could watch my face when I found out. You did all of that. That was your plan." He was silent. "I think," she said, "you've spent 10 years believing that you were the only person in the room thinking ahead. I think that's worth examining now." The line was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want?" he said, finally. The words he had never in 10 years said to her with that particular weight behind them. "I don't want anything from you," she said. "I never did. I just want you to know, really understand that the woman you thought you destroyed walked out of that courthouse yesterday already 3 steps ahead of where you thought she was." She ended the call. Richard sat in the silence of the 42nd floor and held the phone in his hand. Outside his window, the city moved the way it always moved. Traffic, light changing, people in the buildings across the street walking between glass walls. The same city, the same evening, the same view he had looked at 10,000 times from this chair. But something in the frame was different now. Something in the way the picture held together had shifted. And Richard Blackwell, who had built his entire sense of reality on the bedrock of his own certainty, sat alone in his office and began slowly, haltingly to understand that the ground beneath that bedrock was not as solid as he had always believed. The call with Belmore Capital and the Whitford Group was scheduled for Wednesday at 10 in the morning. By Tuesday night, 2 more institutional investors had sent similar inquiry requests. By Wednesday morning, before the 10 o'clock call even started, Richard's legal team had received a formal notice from the State Coastal Regulatory Office requesting a documentation review of the harbor project's original approval. The report had not just circulated, it had landed. Marcus Webb sat across from Richard in the conference room before the investor call and said carefully, "The document that's circulating is not something a generalist produced. This came from someone who understood the specific intersections between the harbor project structure and the coastal amendments." "Richard, how much did Emily know about this project?" Richard looked at him, and in that silence, Marcus got his answer. "How much does she know about everything?" Marcus asked. Richard said nothing. And that was the moment Marcus Webb, who had practiced law for 22 years and had never once seen Richard Blackwell without a ready answer, understood that something had changed fundamentally. That the man sitting across from him had built a decade's worth of certainty on a foundation he had never once thought to examine the assumption that the woman beside him was not paying attention. The investor call began at 10. Emily was not on it, but she was in it. In every pointed question from Belmore's lead partner, in every citation of the regulatory clause that Whitford's attorney read aloud from page 9 of the original approval document. In every silence that followed Richard's answers, those careful, brief silences that investors use when they are deciding whether they still trust you. Richard answered every question. He was polished, he was experienced, he was even now impressive to watch. But the questions had been prepared by someone who knew exactly which answers would be insufficient. By the end of the call, both groups had formally requested an independent third-party review of the harbor project before proceeding with their next funding phase. Richard ended the call. The room was quiet. His CFO looked at the table. His lead attorney looked at his legal pad. His head of investor relations looked at the door. And Richard Blackwell looked at the space in front of him and thought about a woman in a gray mid-range suit walking out of a courtroom the previous morning, and realized with the specific, undeniable clarity of a man finally understanding something that should have been obvious much earlier, that she had not been defeated when she walked out of that courthouse. She had been finished. Finished with the preparation. Finished with the waiting. Finished with the years of careful silence. And whatever was coming next was not the work of someone who was broken. It was the work of someone who had been ready for a very long time. Richard Blackwell did not sleep Wednesday night. That was not something he would have admitted to anyone in his life. Not to Marcus Webb, not to his CFO, Daniel Cho, not to his personal assistant, Joel, not to the 4 members of his senior leadership team who had sat in that conference room after the investor call ended and watched him collect himself with the careful efficiency of a man who had spent decades mastering the art of appearing unaffected. He told all of them to go home. He told them the situation was manageable. He told them Wednesday had been a rough day in a long sequence of good ones, and that perspective was everything in moments like this. Then he went back to his office, closed the door, and sat at his desk until 2 a.m. going through the harbor project documentation with a level of attention he had not given it since the early planning stages. Because he needed to understand something. He needed to understand how much she knew. Not approximately, not generally, specifically. Page by page, clause by clause, he needed to map the knowledge required to produce that 43-page report and match it against every moment Emily had been present, every dinner where the harbor project came up, every document that had ever passed through the Home Office, every conversation she might have overheard, every meeting she had attended as the quiet woman in the good dress who never said anything that mattered. By 1 a.m. he had his answer, and it was worse than he had imagined. Because the report was not the work of someone who had stumbled onto a few concerning details. It was the work of someone who had been reading, thinking, and cross-referencing for years. The specific intersection of the Southeastern Parcel's approval gap with the Coastal Amendment was not obvious. His own legal team had missed it. 3 separate sets of outside counsel had reviewed the harbor project documentation over the past 4 years, and none of them had flagged it. You had to understand both the project structure and the regulatory landscape, and you had to have read both carefully enough to see where they connected in a way that created risk. Emily had done that. Emily, who had sat beside him at dinner tables and charity events and board presentations for 10 years, had done that. He set down the document and looked at the ceiling. The specific feeling moving through him was not one he had vocabulary for, because it was a combination of things that did not normally exist together in Richard Blackwell's emotional register. There was anger, yes. There was something that might have been fear, though he would never have named it that. But underneath both of those was something quieter and more unsettling, which was the beginning of a recognition he was not yet ready to complete. The recognition that he had looked at Emily Carter for 10 years and seen exactly what he expected to see, and that his expectations had been so complete, so total, so structurally embedded in how he understood their marriage and his world, that he had never once questioned whether the picture he was seeing was accurate. He had been wrong, not about a detail, not about a number or a date or a contract term. He had been wrong about a person. He picked up his phone and called Marcus. Marcus answered on the second ring, which meant Marcus had also not been sleeping. "Tell me what you need," Marcus said. "I need to know the full scope of the exposure," Richard said. "Not what we told the investors today, the real scope. I want you and Daniel in my office at 7 tomorrow morning with the complete picture." "We'll be there," Marcus said. There was a pause. Then Marcus said, "Richard, how bad is it?" Richard thought about the Southeastern Parcel. He thought about the Coastal Amendment. He thought about the way Belmore's lead partner had quoted page 9 of the original approval document during Wednesday's call, the precision of it, the way the man had read directly from the text as if he had been studying it. "It's manageable," Richard said, "but it's not what I told anyone it was." He hung up. He did not call Emily again that night, but he thought about calling her at least a dozen times. What he could not reconcile, sitting at his desk in the dark on the 42nd floor, was the gap between what he had believed and what was true. He had designed the divorce to happen exactly as it had happened. The account freezes the courthouse timing, the careful financial structuring that left Emily with a buyout that appeared generous and was in fact a very efficient way of removing her from every meaningful asset. He had designed it over a period of 14 months with his legal team and his financial advisors and his personal assistant coordinating the details, and he had been satisfied with the design because it was clean and because it was final and because it sent a message he wanted sent. The message was you were replaceable, and he had delivered it in the most efficient possible way. What he had not once considered, not in 14 months of planning, not in a single conversation with Marcus or Daniel or Joel, was that Emily might have also been designing something, over a longer period, with more patience, with a depth of knowledge that he had been providing her inadvertently for years. That thought kept returning to him throughout the night. He had given her everything she needed, every dinner table conversation, every document that passed through the home office, every project discussion he had within her earshot because she was furniture reliable and quiet and always present and never a threat. He had built her the blueprint of his empire and handed it to her piece by piece over the course of a decade, and never once thought to wonder what she was doing with what she saw. Thursday morning arrived. Marcus and Daniel were in his office at 5 minutes to 7, both of them with the careful, composed expressions of people who have had time to prepare what they are about to say and are not entirely sure how it will be received. Daniel Cho was Richard's CFO, 51 years old, precise in speech, the kind of man who expressed concern through the specific way he chose his words rather than through tone or expression. He opened his folder and set it on Richard's desk and said, "The full exposure on the harbor project accounting for the regulatory review that's now been formally requested, the investor hold, and the downstream effects on the 3 subsidiary projects that are contingent on Harbor's timeline, we're looking at a potential freeze of approximately $260 million in committed capital." Richard said nothing. Daniel continued, "That's not a loss figure. That's a hold figure. If the regulatory review resolves in our favor, most of that unlocks. But the review timeline is not in our control, and given the specificity of the concerns that have been raised, we should not assume resolution will be quick." "How long?" Richard said. 6 to 14 months, Daniel said, conservatively. Marcus added, "The reputational piece is harder to quantify. Belmore and Whitford are connected to every institutional group in our investor network. The way those calls went yesterday, the questions they asked, the precision of them, that's going to move through the community faster than the regulatory piece." Richard looked at both of them. "Who produced the report?" "Crestline Risk Partners," Marcus said. "We've had 3 people working since yesterday to find out what it is. We found a business registration filed 11 months ago in Delaware. The listed principals are 2 individuals with no prior public profile. The address is a registered agent service." "It's a shell," Richard said. "Almost certainly," Marcus said. "But a shell created 11 months ago by someone who knew this review was coming." 11 months ago, Richard and Emily had still been married, still living in the apartment on the Upper East Side, still attending the same dinners, the same events, the same board presentations. 11 months ago, Emily Carter had been his wife, and she had been building the vehicle for this quietly, carefully from inside the life they shared. He sat back in his chair. "Richard," Marcus said carefully, "I have to ask you directly. Is there any possibility that Emily has documentation, physical or digital, from inside the project, from inside the company?" Richard thought about the home office, the desk he never locked, the filing cabinet in the second drawer of which he had kept the original harbor development approval documents because he liked to review the physical copies when he was thinking through the project structure in the evenings. He thought about the Tuesday morning 6 years ago when he had been on a conference call and Emily had been somewhere in the apartment and he had not given a single thought to where. "It's possible," he said. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "Then we need to approach this differently than a standard investor relations problem. This is a legal exposure situation. We need to understand the full scope of what she might have and build our response around that reality." "What does that mean practically?" Richard asked. "It means," Marcus said, "that the first conversation we need to have is not with the investors, it's with Emily." Richard was quiet. "Or rather," Marcus continued carefully. It means we need to understand what she wants, because someone who spent 11 months building this and timed it the way she timed it the day after the divorce finalization is not acting without a purpose. She told me she doesn't want anything, Richard said. Both Marcus and Daniel looked at him. She told you that directly, Daniel said. Yesterday evening, I called her. Marcus set down his pen. What exactly did she say? Richard thought about the call, the calm in her voice, the patience of it, the way she had turned his question back on him without answering it, and made him feel for the first time in as long as he could remember that he was the one behind in the conversation. She said she didn't want anything from me, he said. She said she never did. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Marcus said very slowly, Richard, if she doesn't want money and she doesn't want the company, then what she produced is not leverage. It's not a negotiating position. It's something else. What? Richard said. Marcus chose his words with the care of a man who had been a lawyer for a long time and understood that precision mattered enormously in moments like this one. It might be a correction, he said. She may simply be making sure the truth of this project is known to the people who should know it, not as a threat, not as a demand, but as a fact. The silence that followed was the longest silence in that office in a very long time. Because if Marcus was right, Richard realized then Emily had not built this as a weapon aimed at him. She had built it as a record. And the difference between a weapon and a record was the difference between something you could negotiate and something you could not. You could not negotiate with the truth. Richard stood up. I need some time. Marcus and Daniel gathered their folders and left without another word. Richard stood at the window of his 42nd floor office and looked at the city below, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt genuinely, completely uncertain about what to do next. That was Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, Emily was sitting in a coffee shop in Hoboken, New Jersey, across a small table from Nathan Hayes, and Nathan was reading through a summary document on his tablet with his reading glasses pushed up to the bridge of his nose. 3 more investor groups reached out this morning, Nathan said without looking up from the tablet. Independent of Belmore and Whitford. They want information about the harbor project. 2 of them are not even directly invested in this deal. They're asking because they have other exposure to Blackwell Holdings, and they want to understand the systemic risk. That's faster than we expected, Emily said. Nathan set down the tablet. He looked at her over his glasses. Yes, which is why I need to ask you something I should have asked earlier. Ask. How are you doing, not strategically, personally? Emily looked at her coffee cup for a moment. Then she looked back at him. I'm fine. Emily. I'm managing it, she said. I knew this week was going to be hard to get through. I knew once it started moving, it would move faster than felt comfortable. Is there any part of you, Nathan said carefully, that questions whether this was the right thing to do? She was quiet for a moment, not because she was uncertain of the answer, but because she wanted to give him an honest one rather than a quick one. The project has real regulatory problems, she said. They exist whether or not I had anything to do with surfacing them. The investors who are now asking questions have a legitimate right to that information. The state regulatory office that has opened a review, they should have had this information before now. So no, I don't question whether it was right. What I question is... She paused. What I question is whether the version of me that started this 2 years ago understood everything the version of me sitting here today understands. Nathan waited. I understood the strategy, she said. I understood the documentation, the timing, the regulatory intersection, the investor relationships. I understood all of that. What I maybe didn't fully understand was how it would feel to watch it actually happen, to know that I set something in motion that can't be stopped, that a company with thousands of employees and dozens of projects is in a period of uncertainty, partly because of decisions I made. Partly because of decisions Richard made, Nathan said. Yes, she said, but also partly because of decisions I made. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That's the difference between intelligence and wisdom, Emily. You had enough intelligence to build this. You're developing enough wisdom to feel the weight of it. That's not a problem. That's how it's supposed to work. She looked at him. What I want you to understand, he said, is that the regulatory problems in the harbor project were going to surface eventually. Construction on a 28-acre parcel with an incomplete approval cannot proceed without that issue becoming apparent. You didn't create the problem. You accelerated the timeline on which it became known, and in doing so, you protected investors who had a right to the information. I know that, she said. Then hold on to it, he said, because the next few weeks are going to require you to hold on to it. She nodded. They went through the summary document together for the next hour, going item by item through the current state of things. 5 investor groups in active inquiry. The formal state regulatory review underway. The Crestline filing still anonymous. Richard's legal team searching, but so far finding nothing traceable back to Emily directly. The documentation Emily had retained from the Harbor Project, the physical copies she had made 6 years earlier, from the original approval file in the Home Office, stored in a safety deposit box in a bank in Philadelphia, under a name that Richard's investigators would not find because it was her mother's maiden name, a name that appeared nowhere in any document connected to the marriage. When Nathan looked up from the last item on the list, he said, "There is one thing we haven't discussed yet." "The board," Emily said. He nodded slowly. "If the investor pressure and the regulatory review combine the way I think they will over the next few weeks, Richard is going to face a board conversation, not a small one." "I know. What's your position when that happens?" Emily was quiet for a long moment. She turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands. Outside the window, the street moved, the way streets move on ordinary Thursday afternoons. People walking to appointments, cars waiting at lights, a delivery truck double-parked while a man in a yellow vest carried boxes into a restaurant. "I don't want Blackwell Holdings destroyed," she said. "I never did. That was never the point. The company employs a lot of people who had nothing to do with any of this. The projects outside the harbor development are real, and they're viable, and they have genuine value." "So what do you want the board to do?" Nathan said. She met his eyes. "I want them to do what they should have been doing for years. I want them to look at how the company is actually run, at the culture Richard created where nobody questions him, at the decisions that got made because everyone around him was too afraid or too dependent to push back." She paused. "The Harbor Project wasn't a mistake. It was a symptom." Nathan studied her for a long moment. "You know, if you say that to a board, they're going to want to know who you are. Crestline won't stay anonymous indefinitely." "I know," she said. "Are you ready for that?" She looked at him steadily. "I've been ready for 2 years." He nodded once. Then he picked up the tablet and made a note. That evening, Richard did something he had not done in many years. He called his older brother. Thomas Blackwell was 59 years old and lived in Connecticut and had left the business world 20 years earlier to teach high school history, a decision Richard had never fully respected and had privately considered a form of retreat. Thomas was the quieter of the 2 brothers, the one who had chosen depth over reach, stability over expansion, a life that Richard had looked at from a distance and understood without finding appealing. But Thomas was also the only person in Richard's life who would tell him the truth when he asked for it. The call lasted 40 minutes. Richard told Thomas the broad outline: the divorce, Emily, the report, the investor calls, the regulatory review. He spoke the way he always spoke, efficiently, precisely, without editorializing, and Thomas listened without interrupting the way he always listened, which was completely. When Richard finished, Thomas said, "Tell me about Emily, not about what she did. Tell me about her." Richard frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, who is she as a person? What did she care about? What was important to her?" Richard was quiet for an uncomfortably long moment. "She's smart," he said finally. "She has good judgment. She's calm under pressure. He stopped. Thomas waited. "She was always paying attention," Richard said, "even when I didn't think she was." "Did you know that while she was your wife?" Thomas asked. Richard thought about the charity dinner 4 years into the marriage, where Nathan Hayes had spoken to Emily for 14 minutes and then looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. He thought about the quarterly report review 2 years after the wedding, where Emily had pointed out a discrepancy in a subsidiary filing, and Richard had said, "I'll have someone look at it," and then had not looked at her again for the rest of the evening. He thought about the morning his mother had called from Florida, and Emily had answered and spoken to her for 40 minutes about things Richard would never have known to ask about, and how his mother had said afterward, "That woman of yours is remarkable, Richard," and how Richard had smiled and changed the subject. "I knew she was intelligent," he said. "I didn't—" He stopped again. "What?" Thomas said. "I didn't take it seriously," Richard said. The words landed differently than he expected them to, like admitting something he had not fully known he was holding. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Richard, what do you actually want here? Not what do you want the company to do, not what do you want your lawyers to do. What do you want?" Richard said nothing for a very long time. Thomas did not rush him. Finally, Richard said, "I want to understand how I didn't see this coming." "That's a different question than I asked," Thomas said. "I know," Richard said, "but it's the one I keep coming back to." Thomas thought for a moment. Then he said quietly, "She spent 10 years being very careful about what she showed you. Maybe the more honest question is why she felt she needed to be." Richard held the phone for a long moment after the call ended. He sat in the living room of the apartment that was now entirely his, the apartment that Emily had helped furnish and decorate and maintain, and that now felt without her presence like a very expensive and very empty shell, and he thought about what Thomas had said, why she felt she needed to be. He thought about the dinner table, the way he had redirected her away from the conversation with Nathan Hayes, the way he had not looked at her after she pointed out the discrepancy in the quarterly filing, the way he had said the evening she came to him about her mother's medical bills, "Learn to manage your requests better." He thought about the 10,000 small moments that added up to a message he had been sending for years without realizing he was sending it. "You do not get to take up space here. You do not get to be seen here. You do not get to matter here in the way that I matter." He had never said those words, but he had said them in every other way available to him, and Emily had received them, and she had made a decision. Not to fight him, not to confront him, not to leave loudly and publicly and dramatically the way the world would have found satisfying, and the way people in those situations sometimes did when they had run out of other options. She had made the decision to wait, to learn, to understand the thing he had built so completely and so deeply that when the moment finally came, she would be the only person in the room who could see it whole. The phone rang. It was Marcus. Richard answered. "I need you to hear this directly," Marcus said, and his voice was careful in a way that immediately told Richard the news was not good. "We've had confirmation from 3 separate sources in the past hour that a formal complaint has been filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding the Harbor Project disclosures. The specific allegation is that material risks were known to Blackwell Holdings leadership and were not disclosed to investors prior to the commitment of funds." Richard was very still. "The Harbor Project, as currently constituted, will be subject to formal SEC inquiry," Marcus said. "This is no longer a regulatory review and an investor relations problem. This is a federal matter." Richard said nothing. "Richard," Marcus said. "I heard you," Richard said. "I need you to come in tomorrow morning, early. We need to get ahead of this." "What time?" Richard said. 6, Marcus said. Richard hung up. He sat in the silence of the apartment. The SEC. Someone had filed with the SEC. He thought about Crestline Risk Partners. He thought about the 43-page report and the 11-month-old Delaware registration and the 2 listed principals with no prior public profile. He thought about the call Emily had ended with the words she had been ready for 2 years. He thought about what it meant that a report specific enough to trigger an SEC inquiry had been in circulation for less than 48 hours before the filing happened. Because that was not an accident. That was timing. The kind of timing that required not just knowledge, but planning. The kind of planning that required knowing not just what the problem was, but who the right people were to hear about it, and when they needed to hear it, and in what sequence the information needed to flow, so that the regulatory response would be swift and complete. Emily had not just surfaced the problem. She had orchestrated the response. He stood up from the chair. He walked to the window of the apartment and stood there for a long time looking at the city below, and he thought about something she had said on the phone the previous evening. "You've spent 10 years believing you were the only person in the room thinking ahead." He had believed that. He had believed it completely. Because he had built his entire sense of self on the idea that he was the architect, the builder, the one who looked at a situation and saw not just what it was, but what it could become if shaped by the right hands. He had believed that about himself so fully, so foundationally, that it had never once occurred to him to look at the woman beside him and wonder if she was doing the same thing. She was. She had been doing exactly that, for years. And she had been so good at it, so careful and precise and patient, that he had never seen it coming. Not once. Not even at the end. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the window and stood there and let the full reality of it settle over him, and it was not pleasant, and it was not something he could push away with confidence or momentum or the practiced certainty of a man who had always won. Because this was not a situation where he had lost on a technicality. He had lost because he had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the contest. He had thought he was the only player. He had been wrong. And now, on a Thursday night in November, with an SEC inquiry opening and 5 investor groups in active questioning and a state regulatory review underway, Richard Blackwell stood at the window of his apartment and finally completely understood what Emily Carter had done. She had not attacked him. She had simply told the truth. And the truth, it turned out, had been waiting for someone to say it out loud for a very long time. Friday came fast. Richard was in the office at 5:45, 20 minutes before Marcus arrived, sitting at his desk with a legal pad in front of him that was completely blank. He had been trying to write down what he knew, what he could control, what the path forward looked like. But every time his pen touched the paper, he found himself thinking about the same thing. Not the SEC, not the investors, not the regulatory review. Emily. Specifically, he kept returning to one moment. A Tuesday morning 6 years ago. A conference call he had taken at his desk in the home office. A call about the Southeastern parcel approval, actually about the timeline for getting the full documentation package to the state coastal office. He remembered sitting at that desk and listening to his project director explain the delay and feeling the slow burn of impatience that came with being told a timeline was longer than he wanted it to be. He remembered ending the call and making a note on his legal pad. He remembered the apartment being quiet. He did not remember where Emily was. He had not thought to look. That was the moment. That was the morning she had read page 9 of the original approval. He was almost certain of it now. He had been on the phone talking about the Southeastern parcel, and she had been 20 feet away reading the document that explained exactly why the Southeastern parcel was a problem. And he had not known, had not suspected, had not even looked up from his legal pad to wonder where his wife was or what she was doing. Marcus arrived at 6 on the dot with Daniel Cho and the company's lead outside counsel, a woman named Patricia Vance, who billed at $900 an hour and had the focused, unhurried manner of someone who had navigated federal inquiries before and understood that panic was a resource that needed to be rationed carefully. Patricia set her bag down, opened it, and pulled out a single folder. "Here's where we are," she said. And she said it without preamble, without the usual brief social temperature check that opened most professional conversations, because she was the kind of person who believed that in a crisis, the greatest kindness you could offer someone was to get immediately to the point. The SEC filing is preliminary. It triggers an inquiry, not an investigation at this stage. The distinction matters. An inquiry means they're gathering information. An investigation means they've concluded there's cause to act. We have time, but not as much time as we'd like. Richard nodded. The regulatory review from the state coastal office is more immediate, she continued. They have the authority to issue a temporary halt on preliminary construction activities if the review is not resolved within 60 days. Given that construction groundwork is scheduled to begin in 8 months, 60 days is uncomfortable but not catastrophic if we move quickly. Move quickly how? Richard asked. By addressing the Southeastern parcel approval directly. The incomplete documentation can be filed. It will require a revised application and a review period, but it is not a disqualifying condition. The problem was never that the condition was unfixable. The problem is that it was not fixed and that material fact was not disclosed to investors as a risk factor. She paused. That is the core of the SEC inquiry, she said, not the condition itself, the non-disclosure of the condition. The room was quiet. Daniel said carefully, "The non-disclosure wasn't intentional. The approval gap was in the documentation, but it was interpreted as a pending administrative item rather than a material risk." Patricia looked at him with the patient expression of a lawyer who had heard that particular sentence many times. "I understand that's the internal interpretation. The question is whether the investors, had they known about the pending administrative item, would have made different decisions about committing capital. And the answer to that question, given the regulatory timeline and the scale of commitment, is almost certainly yes, which means the SEC will treat the non-disclosure as material regardless of the intent behind it." Richard said, "What's the recommendation?" "Voluntary disclosure," Patricia said immediately, "before the inquiry deepens. A full proactive disclosure to the SEC and to all investors of the complete regulatory status of the project, accompanied by a remediation plan for the Southeastern parcel approval and a revised project timeline." "That's going to cost us," Daniel said. "It will cost you less than the alternative," Patricia said. Richard looked at her. "And the source of the original report?" Patricia folded her hands on the table. "That's a separate matter. If the report was produced using confidential proprietary information that was obtained improperly, there may be a legal claim." But pursuing that claim while a federal inquiry is open is not advisable. It creates a narrative that the company's primary response to a disclosure problem is to attack the person who disclosed it. That narrative is damaging in ways that are very difficult to recover from. Richard understood what she was not saying as clearly as what she was saying. He could not go after Emily. Not right now. Not in any visible direct way. Any move that looked like retaliation would accelerate the narrative the SEC inquiry had already begun to establish. He was in a position where the only viable strategic path was transparency and remediation, and any deviation from that path was going to compound the damage. He had frozen her accounts to make her small, and she had maneuvered him into a position where the only thing he could do was be completely honest. The symmetry of it was almost architectural. "Schedule the investor calls," Richard said. "All of them, this week. I want to get ahead of every group before the weekend." "We'll start at 10, Marcus said. "And Patricia," Richard said, "the voluntary disclosure to the SEC, I want that drafted today." Patricia nodded and picked up her pen. The morning investor calls began at 10 and ran without interruption until nearly 2 in the afternoon. 5 groups, 5 conversations that required Richard to sit in the conference room and deliver in clear and professional language a version of events that acknowledged the incomplete approval, the regulatory review, and the company's plan to address it. 5 conversations where he sat across from people who had trusted him with hundreds of millions of dollars and had to listen to carefully worded questions that were underneath the professional language asking the same thing. What else don't we know? By the 4th call, Richard noticed something. Every investor group, regardless of the specific questions they asked, came back to the same point. They had received the Crestline report. They had read it. And the thing that had unsettled them was not primarily the regulatory gap, which was real, but addressable. What had unsettled them was the suggestion in the report's conclusion. 2 paragraphs at the very end of the 43 pages that the Harbor Project's specific problems were illustrative of a broader structural issue in how Blackwell Holdings was governed. A culture, the report suggested, in which risk information moved only upward to a single decision-maker was filtered through that decision-maker's assumptions and was never subject to independent challenge. That was the part they kept asking about, not just the Harbor Project, the company. By the 5th call, Richard had heard the phrase independent oversight 3 times. He had heard board structure twice. He had heard checks and balances once from a partner who had couched it in hypothetical language, but whose meaning was completely clear. When the last call ended and the conference room emptied, Richard sat alone for a long time. Then he called Emily. She answered on the 2nd ring this time. He said without greeting, the conclusion of the report, the 2 paragraphs at the end about governance and culture. She said nothing. "That wasn't about the project," he said. "That was about me." A pause. Then she said, "It was about the conditions that allowed the project to develop the way it did." "Which is me," he said. She did not confirm or deny it. "Every investor I spoke to today came back to those 2 paragraphs," he said. "They're not just asking about the Harbor Project anymore. They're asking about whether the company can be trusted in a structure where one person has absolute authority." She was quiet. "I need to know something," he said, directly. "Is this about destroying the company, or is this about changing it?" "Those were never the same thing," she said. "Then what do you want to happen?" She exhaled slowly. When she spoke, her voice was steady and even, but there was something in it that was different from the 2 previous calls, something closer to the surface. "I want the investors who trusted you to have accurate information. I want the employees who work for your company to have a future that isn't built on a structure that collapses the moment you make a mistake. I want the people who come after you, whoever runs that company in 20 years, to inherit something that was built honestly." She paused. "I never wanted you to fall, Richard. I wanted the things around you to become real, instead of just being a reflection of your confidence." He held the phone for a long moment. Then he said something he had never said to her. Not once, in 10 years. "I didn't see you." She was quiet. "I looked at you for 10 years, he said, "and I didn't see you. I knew you were intelligent. I knew you were capable. And I filed that information away in a category labeled not relevant, and I never took it back out. And that was—" He stopped. He seemed to be deciding something. "That was wrong. What I did was wrong." Emily said nothing for a very long time. When she spoke, her voice was quiet and careful, as if she were lifting something fragile. "I know you believe that right now," she said, "and I believe that you mean it. But Richard, that understanding is for you. It's not something I need from you. Not anymore." The call ended. Richard set the phone on the conference table and sat in the empty room for a very long time. Outside, his company moved the way it always moved. Phones ringing, elevators running, people in the corridors walking between their offices with the focused efficiency of people who did not yet fully understand how close the ground beneath them was shifting. Nathan Hayes was in Philadelphia that Friday afternoon, sitting in the waiting room of a medical office where Emily's mother, Jean Carter, was having a routine cardiology appointment. He had offered to drive Jean because Emily was in New York and the appointment had been on the calendar for 6 weeks, and Jean had quietly mentioned that she didn't like driving in city traffic anymore. Emily had told him he absolutely did not need to do that. He had done it anyway. His phone buzzed with a message from Emily. He called again. "Different conversation this time," Nathan typed back. "Different how?" A pause. Then, "He said he didn't see me." Nathan stared at the message for a moment. Then he typed, "How did that feel?" Another pause, longer this time. Like closing a door I'd been holding open without realizing it. Nathan set his phone down and thought about what he knew about Emily Carter, which was a great deal because he had spent 18 months working alongside her on the most precisely constructed financial risk disclosure project he had encountered in 28 years of professional practice. He had known from very early on that her intelligence was extraordinary. What he had come to understand more slowly was the emotional architecture underneath it. The way she carried things, the way she had organized the grief and the anger and the years of quiet invisibility into something that functioned rather than something that festered. It was not normal what she had done. Most people in her position would have done one of two things. They would have either fought loudly, hired aggressive lawyers, pursued every asset, aggressively made the divorce public and damaging in the ways divorces can be when one party is motivated by pain. Or they would have done what Richard expected, retreated, accepted the reduced circumstances, rebuilt quietly and separately. Emily had done neither. She had chosen a third path that required something most people simply did not have: the discipline to feel everything she was feeling and still think clearly, the patience to wait 2 years for the right moment, the precision to execute something this complex without a single visible error. Nathan had once told her late in the planning process that what she was doing required a kind of courage that was different from the obvious kind. The obvious kind of courage was loud. It was public. It announced itself. What Emily was doing required the courage to be completely alone with something difficult for a very long time, without anyone knowing you were carrying it, without any external validation, without any guarantee that it would work. She had said, or maybe buyers being tired enough of the alternative. He had thought about that sentence many times since. He was thinking about it now. Jean Carter came out of the appointment looking well, which she was, and she asked Nathan if he wanted to stop for coffee on the way back, which he did, and they sat in a small cafe for 40 minutes, and Jean talked about Emily the way mothers talk about their children when they are simultaneously proud of them and frightened for them. "She doesn't tell me everything," Jean said. "She never has. Even when she was small, she would work through things on her own, and then come to me when she was ready. I used to worry about that. I used to think she needed to learn how to ask for help." Nathan looked at her. "Now I think," Jean said slowly, "that maybe she knew something I didn't about what help was actually available to her." Nathan thought about Richard Blackwell. He thought about the home office with the unlocked door and the filing cabinet in the second drawer. He thought about 10 years of dinners and events and conversations where Emily had been present and invisible at the same time. "She's going to be all right," he said. Jean looked at him with the steady, unconvinced gaze of a mother who had seen her daughter try to be all right through things that were not all right and who knew the difference. "I know she's going to survive this," Jean said. "That's not what I'm asking." Nathan understood. "She's going to do more than survive," he said. "I think she's going to become someone she could never have become if things had gone differently." Jean held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the table. "She was always that person," she said quietly. She just spent 10 years in a room where nobody could see it. Back in New York, the afternoon was moving toward evening, and the city was doing what the city always did, pushing forward, relentless and indifferent, and Emily was sitting in the hotel room she had been quietly extending her reservation on 1 week at a time, because she was not yet ready to commit to a permanent address, because something in her understood that the shape of her life after this was still forming, and she did not want to lock it down prematurely. She had a laptop open and a legal notepad beside it, and she was working on something she had not told Nathan about yet. It was not related to the harbor project. It was not related to Richard or the SEC or the investor calls or Crestline Risk Partners or any of the pieces of the plan that were currently in motion. It was something else entirely. It had started 3 weeks before the divorce on a Tuesday afternoon when she had been sitting in this same hotel room and had received an email from a woman she did not know, a woman who had found Emily's personal email address through a professional network and had written 3 paragraphs explaining that she was the chief of staff at a mid-sized company in Chicago, that her CEO was a man very similar in structure to Richard Blackwell, that she had been watching things go wrong for 2 years without knowing how to act on what she knew, and that she had heard through 3 degrees of professional separation that Emily Carter might understand her situation. Emily had sat with that email for a long time. Then she had written back. Not about the harbor project. Not about Blackwell Holdings. Not about anything connected to her own situation. She had written back about what the woman described, asked careful questions, listened to the answers, and over the course of 5 email exchanges, spanning 2 weeks, had helped the woman organize her thinking about what she knew, what documentation she should be gathering, who the right people were to speak to, and how to time the conversation she needed to have. The woman's name was Catherine. Emily did not know her last name. They had never spoken on the phone. 3 days ago, Catherine had written to say that she had finally had the conversation she needed to have with the board member she had identified as the right entry point, and that the conversation had gone better than she had hoped, and that for the first time in 2 years, she felt like she was standing on solid ground. She had ended the email by asking, "How did you know how to see all of this so clearly?" Emily had not answered yet. She was thinking about the answer now. She was thinking about all the things that had taught her to see clearly. The 10 years of watching Richard move through the world, the specific education of being invisible in a room full of powerful people. You learned things that visible people never learned because visible people were always managing their own presence, always adjusting how they were being perceived, always partly occupied with the performance of themselves. Invisible people could simply watch, listen, connect things. She had received an extraordinary education. She had paid an extraordinary price for it. The question was what to do with it. She was still thinking about that question when her phone buzzed. It was not Nathan. It was a number she recognized but had not expected to hear from. Stephen Park Richards, head of investor relations. She stared at the number for a moment, then she answered. "Emily," Stephen said. His voice was careful, professional, stripped of the social warmth that usually cushioned his conversations. "I'm sorry to call directly. I got your number from the court filing. I want you to know this is not a call Richard asked me to make." "Why are you calling Stephen?" she said. "Because," he said, and then he paused, and in the pause she could hear him deciding how honest to be. "Because I've been with this company for 9 years, and I care about what happens to it, and I've spent the last 3 days in conversations that have made me realize something I probably should have realized a long time ago." "What's that?" she said. "That the person who understands this company's vulnerabilities better than anyone currently employed by it is you," he said, "and that the board is going to convene an emergency meeting within the next 2 weeks, and that without someone who has your depth of understanding at that table, the conversation is going to be very incomplete." Emily was quiet. "I'm not asking you to protect Richard," Stephen said quickly. "I understand that's not something you should do and not something anyone has the right to ask. I'm asking you to consider whether the company itself, the 1,700 people who work here, the projects that have nothing to do with the harbor development, the institutional relationships that could survive this, if they're handled correctly, whether those things are worth one conversation." She said nothing. "Emily," he said, "you clearly spent years understanding how this company works. Not just what's wrong with it, what's right with it, what's worth saving. If there's a board conversation happening about the future of Blackwell Holdings, you are the most qualified person in the world to be in it." The silence stretched out. Emily looked at the notepad beside her laptop, the notes she had been making about Catherine's situation, about the email she was still composing about how to see clearly. "Who on the board is convening the meeting?" she said. "Margaret Osei," Stephen said. Emily knew the name. Margaret Osei was the longest-serving independent board member at Blackwell Holdings, 64 years old, former COO of a major infrastructure company, famously rigorous, famously independent, the person on the board who Richard respected, and also Emily knew, was faintly wary of because Margaret Osei was one of the few people in his professional circle who looked at him without being dazzled. "Has Margaret seen the Crestline report?" Emily asked. "She received it the same day as the investors," Stephen said. She called me that evening. She asked me 3 questions. The first was about the southeastern parcel. The second was about the governance structure of the company. The third was whether I knew anything about Crestline Risk Partners. "What did you tell her?" Emily said. "I told her the truth," Stephen said, "which was that I didn't know, but I had a guess." Silence. "Emily," he said, "Margaret Osei wants to talk to you." Emily set the phone against her shoulder and looked at the ceiling. This was not in the plan. Not because it was unwelcome, but because it was 3 steps ahead of where she had expected things to be at this point. She had imagined a board meeting happening. She had imagined the aftermath of the regulatory and investor pressure forcing a structural conversation at the governance level. She had not imagined being called before that meeting happened. She had not imagined being invited to the table. She thought about what Nathan had said in the coffee shop in Hoboken, that Crestline would not stay anonymous indefinitely, that the board conversation was coming. She thought about Stephen's words, the 1,700 people, the projects that have nothing to do with the harbor development. She thought about her mother, about Catherine's email, about the woman she was in the process of becoming, and the question of what that woman did with everything she knew. "Tell Margaret I'll take her call," Emily said. Stephen exhaled. "I'll reach out today." "One condition," Emily said. "Name it." "The call is just us, not legal teams, not advisors, not anyone else in the room, Margaret and me." A pause. "I'll pass that along," Stephen said. Emily hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote 1 sentence on the notepad. "The question is never whether to use what you know. The question is how." She looked at the sentence for a moment. Then she underlined it. Across the city, Richard was ending his day with a conversation he had not planned. He had been standing in the elevator lobby of the 42nd floor, waiting for the car to arrive, when his phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. The text said, "How are you doing, not the company, you." Richard stood in the empty lobby with the text on his screen and thought about what the honest answer was. The honest answer was that he was not doing well, not in a way he could quantify with numbers or address with strategy. The company was in difficulty, and difficulty was something he knew how to move through. Difficulty had a shape and a logic and a set of tools that could be applied to it. What he was feeling was something different. It did not have a shape. It did not respond to tools. I thought about the investor calls, the careful questions about governance and culture, the phrase independent oversight spoken 3 separate times by 3 separate people, each time landing like a small, precise correction. He thought about Emily's voice on the phone, the steadiness of it, the absence of triumph in it which he had expected and which had not come. Not once. She had not spoken to him from a position of victory. She had spoken to him from a position of clarity, and the difference between those 2 things was something he was still trying to understand. He texted Thomas back. "I think I've spent 20 years building something I believed in, and I'm only now starting to understand that I built it alone, and that the aloneness was a choice I made without knowing I was making it." He sent the text. He looked at it for a moment after it sent. It was the most honest thing he had typed to another person in longer than he could remember. Thomas responded 40 seconds later. "That's the most self-aware thing you've ever said to me." Then a second message. "What are you going to do with it?" Richard stepped into the elevator when it arrived. He looked at Thomas's question on his screen as the elevator descended. He did not have an answer yet, but for the first time since Wednesday morning, that absence felt less like failure and more like the beginning of something. Like the feeling of a room being opened that had been closed for a long time. Not comfortable exactly, not easy, but honest in a way that felt unexpectedly, and despite everything, like the right direction. The elevator reached the lobby. Richard walked out into the evening. And somewhere across the city, in a small hotel room with a window that faced a wall, Emily Carter picked up her phone and began composing the email she had been thinking about all day. The one to Catherine. The one that would answer the question of how she had learned to see things clearly. She wrote, "You learn to see clearly when the cost of staying blind becomes higher than the cost of the truth. And once you see, you have a choice about what to do with what you see. That choice is everything. That choice is where your life actually begins." She read it back. Then she pressed send. Margaret Osei called on Saturday morning at 9:15. Emily had been awake since 6, sitting at the hotel desk with coffee she had made from the small machine on the counter, working through notes she had been keeping since Thursday. Not about Blackwell Holdings specifically, about the board conversation that was coming and what it needed to contain to be useful rather than merely reactive. because Emily had spent enough time watching Richard run meetings to understand that the difference between a board conversation that changed something and one that simply documented a crisis was whether the people in the room were asking the right questions before they started looking for answers. When the phone rang, she picked it up on the first ring. "Emily Carter," she said. "Margaret Osei." The voice was direct, unhurried, and carried the specific quality of a person who had spent decades in rooms where attention was a resource and wasting it was unprofessional. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me." "Thank you for calling," Emily said. A brief pause. Then Margaret said, "I'm going to be straightforward with you if that's all right." "Please," Emily said. "I've been on the board of Blackwell Holdings for 11 years, Margaret said. In that time, I have raised concerns about governance structure on 4 separate occasions, not loudly, through the appropriate channels, through the audit committee, through conversations with Richard directly, through the board's annual governance review. Each time those concerns were acknowledged, documented, and not meaningfully addressed." Emily said nothing. She was listening with the specific quality of attention she brought to things that mattered. "The report that circulated this week," Margaret continued, "identified problems I have known about in some form for years, not with that level of specificity on the regulatory piece that was new information to me. But the structural argument in the conclusion, the governance analysis, that was not new." "I know," Emily said. A pause. "You know because you wrote it," Margaret said. It was not a question. Emily was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, "I know because I lived inside the structure it describes for 10 years. Margaret absorbed that. "The southeastern parcel approval gap," she said. "How long have you known about it?" 6 years, Emily said. The silence on the other end of the line was the silence of a woman recalibrating, not because she was surprised exactly, but because the specific number carried weight. 6 years was not a recent discovery. 6 years was not something stumbled upon in the course of a divorce. 6 years was a long time to carry a piece of information and wait for the right moment to use it responsibly. "Why didn't you come forward with it earlier?" Margaret asked. Emily had anticipated this question. She had thought about the honest answer for a long time, and the honest answer was complicated in the way that true things are often complicated. "Because I wasn't in a position to be heard," she said. "I was Richard's wife, not a board member, not an investor, not an employee. Anything I said about the company would have been filtered through that relationship in a way that made it easy to dismiss, and Richard would have dismissed it." She paused. "The information needed to reach people who had the standing to act on it. That required a different pathway." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's an honest answer." "It's the only kind I have," Emily said. Another pause. Then Margaret said, "The board is convening Thursday. I want you to be present." Emily had been expecting this. Stephen had prepared her for it. But hearing it from Margaret directly in that measured, unhurried voice made it real in a different way. "In what capacity?" Emily said. "As someone who can speak to the operational and structural realities of how this company has been run," Margaret said. "Not as a witness for any legal proceeding, not as an adversary to Richard, as someone who has knowledge relevant to the board's deliberations." "Does Richard know you're calling me?" Emily asked. "No," Margaret said. "This is my call to make as board chair for this emergency session. I will inform him that you've been invited to present before the board convenes. That notification will happen Monday." Emily thought about Richard receiving that notification on Monday morning. She thought about what it would feel like for him to learn that the woman he had frozen out of his life was being invited to sit at his board table by the one board member he had never been fully able to manage. She thought about whether she was ready for what that room was going to feel like. "I'll be there," Emily said. "Thursday at 10, Margaret said. "The address will come from my assistant this afternoon." The call lasted 4 more minutes, covering logistics Emily absorbed without writing down, because she did not need to write them down. When it ended, she set the phone on the desk and sat very still. She had planned for many things over the past 2 years. She had not planned for this specific moment, the feeling of it, the weight of being invited rather than fighting for a seat. The difference between those two things was not strategic, it was personal. It was the difference between a world in which you took what you were owed and a world in which someone with authority looked at you and said your knowledge belongs in this room. She picked up her phone and called Nathan. He answered on the first ring. "I heard from Stephen," he said immediately. "Margaret called you." "She did," Emily said, "and I'm going Thursday." Nathan was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had a different quality than usual. something warmer underneath the precision. "Emily, do you understand what this is?" "It's a board presentation," she said. "It's a board presentation at the company where you were invisible for 10 years, he said. "At the table where decisions were made that affected your life without anyone asking you a single question. And you've been invited there by the board chair. Not because you demanded it, because the work you did was so thorough and so credible that the most serious person on that board decided the conversation couldn't happen without you." She was quiet. "That's not a strategy outcome," Nathan said. "That's a personal one." She looked at the notepad on the desk, the sentence she had written 3 days ago. "The question is never whether to use what you know. The question is how." "I know," she said. "I know what it is." She could hear him exhale slowly. "What do you need from me between now and Thursday?" "I need you to help me prepare a presentation that doesn't feel like an attack," she said. "The board needs to understand the structural problems clearly enough to act on them. They don't need to be handed a case against Richard. That's not what changes a company." "What changes a company?" Nathan asked. "Giving the people responsible for it a clear enough picture of what it actually is that they can make real decisions," she said. "Not the picture Richard presented, the real one." Nathan said, "All right, come to my office Monday morning. We'll build it together." After she hung up, Emily sat with the quiet of the hotel room for a long time. Then she did something she had been putting off for 3 weeks. She called her mother and told her the truth. Not all of it. Not the Crestline structure or the Delaware registration or the specific regulatory mechanics of the southeastern parcel, but the real shape of things, what she had done, why she had done it, what was happening now, what Thursday meant. Jean Carter listened without interrupting, which was not something she did easily. Emily could hear her mother's breathing on the other end of the line, steady and careful, the breathing of a woman absorbing something that was larger than she had understood. When Emily finished, Jean was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "How long have you been carrying this alone?" 2 years, Emily said. Another silence. "Baby," Jean said, and her voice had changed, not to worry or to criticism, to something that was simply love without any modifier attached to it. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I needed you to not worry," Emily said, "and I knew if you knew you'd worry." "I would have," Jean said, "but I also would have been proud of you. And you deserve to hear that while you were in the middle of it, not just at the end." Emily felt something move through her chest, the specific feeling of hearing the right thing too late and almost the right time simultaneously. "I'm proud of you now," Jean said. "Whatever happens Thursday, whatever happens after, I want you to know that." Emily pressed her hand against her mouth for a moment. Then she said, "I know, Mom, I know." That was Saturday. Sunday passed quietly. Emily worked. She read through the documentation she had stored in Philadelphia, the originals she had never needed to use, because the copies had been sufficient. She organized her thinking. She slept more than she had expected to, which meant her body was doing what it needed to do, releasing the tension it had been holding through weeks of precise, controlled execution. Monday morning, she arrived at Nathan's office at 8:30, an hour before they had arranged because she had been awake at 5, and there was nowhere else she needed to be. Nathan was already there. He had coffee and 2 legal pads and the entire Crestline documentation spread across the conference table in a specific order that told her he had also been working all weekend. They worked for 9 hours. They built a presentation that was 40 minutes long and had no redundancy and no editorializing and no language that was designed to wound. It presented the Harbor Project's regulatory situation factually and completely. It presented the governance structure of Blackwell Holdings as a documented pattern rather than an individual failure. It drew a clear line between the company's genuine strengths, and there were many. Nathan had insisted on their inclusion, and Emily had agreed immediately, and the specific structural conditions that had allowed the Harbor Project's problems to develop without adequate review. At 3 in the afternoon, Nathan sat back and looked at what they had built. "There's one thing missing," he said. Emily looked at him. "Your recommendation," he said. "Not about the Harbor Project, about the company, what you think the board should do." She had been thinking about this since Saturday morning. "Richard should remain in a leadership role," she said. "Not because I'm protecting him, because the company's value is substantially connected to his relationships and his reputation in the industry, and removing him entirely in the middle of a federal inquiry creates a narrative that's worse than the one we already have." Nathan nodded slowly. But he cannot be the only voice in the room anymore," she said. "The company needs an independent operating structure, a COO with real authority, an audit function that reports directly to the board, not to the CEO, and a governance review every 18 months with an outside firm, not with advisors Richard selects. Nathan looked at her for a long time. You understand, he said carefully, that those recommendations, if the board adopts them, remove the absolute control Richard has had for 20 years. Yes, she said. And you're not doing this to hurt him, Nathan said. No, she said. I'm doing it because it's what the company actually needs. And because if Richard is going to build something worth building, he needs people around him who can tell him when he's wrong. He's never had that. I thought for a long time that was his fault. Now I think it's more complicated than that. Nobody built the structure that would have allowed it. Nathan studied her. Have you told him any of this? Not yet, she said. Are you going to... She picked up her pen and made a small note on the legal pad. Before Thursday, she said. He shouldn't hear it for the first time in the boardroom. Nathan raised his eyebrows slightly. That's generous. It's not generous, she said. It's just honest. Walking into that board meeting and surprising him with a restructuring recommendation in front of his own directors, that's not what this is for. I'm not there to embarrass him. I'm there because the company needs what I know. Nathan said nothing for a moment. Then he said, You know, most people in your position would not make that distinction. Most people in my position spent 10 years learning that how you do something matters as much as what you do, she said. He nodded once and did not say anything further. Tuesday morning, Emily called Richard. He answered on the first ring, which told her he had been expecting the call. Margaret called you, he said, not a question. Saturday, Emily said. A pause. And you said yes. I said yes. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear something in the silence that was different from the silences in their previous calls, less contained. The silence of a man who was working through something in real time. I need to know what you're going to say, he said. I know you do, she said. That's why I'm calling, she told him. She told him methodically and completely, walking him through the 40-minute presentation, the same way she and Nathan had structured it, not softer and not harder than what she had prepared for the board. She told him the harbor project section. She told him the governance section. She told him the recommendations. When she reached the recommendations, he said nothing. She finished and waited. The silence lasted nearly 30 seconds. Then Richard said, in a voice that was quieter than she had heard from him in any of their calls, You're not asking them to remove me. No, she said. Why not? She thought about how to answer that. Then she decided that he deserved the same honesty she had given him on everything else. Because removing you doesn't fix what's wrong, she said. It's a consequence, not a solution. The structural problems exist whether you're there or not. The solution is building a structure that doesn't depend on one person being infallible. She paused. Nobody is infallible, Richard. Not even you. And the company has been operating as though you are. That's the thing that needs to change. He was quiet again. Then he said, The COO recommendation, independent authority. Yes. The audit function reporting to the board. Yes. The 18-month governance review with an outside firm. Yes. Another pause. Then, you know what you're describing as a company that looks very different from the one I built. I know, she said. I built it the way I built it because I believed the way I did things was the right way, he said. Not because I was arrogant, because I genuinely believed I had better judgment than the people around me. Sometimes you did, Emily said. He seemed surprised by that. You think so? Richard, you built a company from nothing into something that employs 1,700 people and has completed dozens of successful projects over 20 years. Your judgment is not the problem. The problem is the system that made your judgment the only judgment, because no one's judgment is good enough to be the only one. He breathed out slowly. Is that what you're going to tell the board? He said. Yes, she said. That's exactly what I'm going to tell them. Another long silence, the longest of any of their calls. Then Richard said, Emily, why are you doing this? Not the original plan. I understand why you did what you did. I understand it better than you might think I do. But this, the board presentation, the recommendations calling me before Thursday. Why? She thought about her mother's voice on Saturday. I would have been proud of you while you were in the middle of it. She thought about Catherine's email. She thought about the sentence on her notepad. Because I spent 10 years in a room where the truth wasn't allowed to take up space, she said. And I know what that costs, not just to me, to everyone in the room, to you, to the company. She paused. I don't want to walk out of Thursday having done the same thing to you that you did to me. I don't want to walk in with information and use it to make you small. I want to walk in with information and use it to make the company real." He said nothing. "That's all this has ever been," she said. "Making things real." The call ended. Emily set her phone down. She did not know what Richard was going to do with what she had said. She did not know whether he would come into Thursday's board meeting prepared to engage with the recommendations or prepared to fight them. She did not know whether the last 48 hours of conversations had moved anything in him or whether the movement was temporary and would harden again when he was back in the room surrounded by the architecture of his own authority. What she knew was that she had done what she could do. She had been honest. And honesty she had learned over 2 years of very careful, very patient work was not a strategy. It was not a weapon. It was not a negotiating position. It was simply the only foundation on which anything real could be built. Wednesday came. Emily spent most of it alone going through the presentation, one final time, not changing it but reading it the way she imagined the board members would read it, looking for places where the language could be misread or where the tone might feel prosecutorial rather than analytical. She found 2 paragraphs in the governance section and softened the phrasing, not to obscure the truth, to make it more receivable. Nathan called at 4 in the afternoon. "How are you?" he said. "Ready," she said. "Nervous." "Yes," she said, "but the right kind of nervous, the kind that means something matters." He said, "I'll be in the building tomorrow, not in the room that's your room, but I'll be there." She smiled. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said. "I'm doing it anyway." After they hung up, she called Thomas Blackwell. This surprised her even as she was doing it. Thomas was Richard's brother. She had no strategic reason to call him, but she had been thinking about him since Richard mentioned the calls they had been having, and something in her understood that Thomas was a thread in this story that deserved acknowledgement. Thomas answered, sounding mildly surprised, but not unwelcoming. "Emily," he said. "I wanted you to know," she said without preamble, "that whatever happens tomorrow, I am not trying to destroy what your brother built. I want you to hear that from me directly." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know that." "How?" she said. "Because Richard told me what you said to him on Tuesday," Thomas said, "about making things real, about the difference between using information to make someone small and using it to make the company honest." A pause. "He called me after he hung up with you. He was quiet for most of the call. But at the end, he said something I've been thinking about since." "What?" she said. "He said, she's the most honest person I've ever dealt with, and I spent 10 years treating her like she was furniture." Emily was quiet. "He's not a bad man," Thomas said. "He's a man who built his whole world without learning how to let other people into it. That's a different thing." "I know," Emily said. "I know that now." "Good luck tomorrow," Thomas said. "Thank you," she said. She set the phone down. Outside the window, the wall of the building next door was exactly the same as it had been every other day she had spent in this room. Brick and shadow, no view, just the solid, ordinary reality of a building doing what buildings do, holding things up. She thought about what Margaret had said on Saturday. "Your knowledge belongs in this room." She thought about Stephen Park's voice when he called her on Friday. The 1,700 people. She thought about Catherine's email and her mother's voice, and Nathan sitting in the waiting room of a cardiology office in Philadelphia because he thought it was the right thing to do. She thought about the Tuesday morning 6 years ago, and the desk she had sat at, and page 9 of a document, and the specific quality of silence in an apartment where nobody was watching her. And she thought about Thursday morning, 10 o'clock. A boardroom she had never been inside, a table she had never been invited to, a conversation that was going to happen that needed to happen, and that was going to be different because she was in it. Not because she had forced her way in, because the truth had weight. And the truth carried carefully enough for long enough, with enough precision and enough patience and enough genuine understanding of what it meant and what it cost, had a way of eventually finding the room it needed to be in. She turned off the light. She set the alarm for 5:30. And she lay in the dark in the hotel room she had been living in for 3 weeks and thought about what it felt like to be exactly where you were supposed to be after a very long time of being somewhere else. It felt like the moment just before something begins. Not relief, not triumph, just the clean, quiet readiness of a woman who had done the work, paid the price, and was finally completely exactly prepared for what came next. Thursday arrived, the way important days always arrive, without fanfare, without any external signal that this morning was different from any other. The alarm went off at 5:30. Emily was already awake. She had been awake since 4. Not from anxiety, or at least not from the kind of anxiety that paralyzes, from the kind that sharpens, the kind that makes every detail feel precise and clear and present. She lay in the dark of the hotel room and went through the presentation in her mind one more time. Not the words exactly, but the logic of it, the structure, the way one section moved into the next, the places where she had decided to pause and let the data speak before adding interpretation. She had done this kind of mental rehearsal before. Every major moment of the past 2 years had been preceded by this same interior process, not performing, settling, getting fully into the truth of what she was about to do, so that when she stood in the actual room, there was no gap between what she felt and what she said. She got up at 5:40. She made coffee. She sat at the desk. At 6:15, a text arrived from Nathan. It said only, "Ready when you are." She smiled at the screen. At 6:45, a text from her mother. "Thinking about you all morning. You're ready. You've always been ready." She read that one twice. At 7, she got dressed. Not in the gray, mid-range suit she had worn to the courthouse 3 weeks ago. That suit had been a costume, a piece of the performance she no longer needed to give. She wore a deep navy blazer she had bought the previous week, tailored. Clean, the kind of thing you wear when you are not performing anything, when you are simply showing up as exactly who you are. She looked at herself in the mirror. For the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, the person looking back at her did not look like a woman managing her appearance. She looked like a woman who had arrived somewhere. She left the hotel at 8:15. The Blackwell Holdings boardroom was on the 43rd floor, one floor above Richard's office, in a space Emily had been inside exactly twice during their marriage. Once for a charity event the company had hosted, once when she had come to the building to bring Richard documents he needed, and had wandered upward out of curiosity while waiting for him. Both times she had stood in the room as a visitor, someone passing through, someone with no claim on the space. She rode the elevator to 43 at 9:55. The elevator doors opened. Stephen Park was waiting in the corridor. He looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression was the expression of a man seeing something he had not expected to see, even though he had arranged for it to happen. Like the reality of Emily Carter arriving at this floor in this building for this meeting was different from the idea of it. "Emily," he said. "Stephen," she said. I extended his hand and she shook it. "The board is assembling," he said. "Margaret is already inside." "How many members?" she asked. 7, he said. "All independent. Richard will be present but not in the room during your presentation, at Margaret's direction." Emily absorbed that. It was the right call strategically and personally, and it was the kind of call that only Margaret Osei would have had the authority and the clarity to make and enforce. "Is he all right with that?" Emily asked. Stephen looked at her with the faint surprise of a man who had not expected that question. "He agreed to it," he said carefully. "Whether he's all right with it is a different question." "That's fair," Emily said. Stephen opened the boardroom door. Emily walked in. The room held 7 people seated around a long table. Margaret Osei sat at the head, her posture, the posture of someone who took up exactly the amount of space they were entitled to, and not a fraction more. She was wearing dark red, which Emily noticed because it was a color that communicated authority without announcing it. The 6 other board members, a range of ages, 2 women, 4 men, all with the specific alert stillness of people who understood that what was about to happen in this room mattered, looked up when Emily entered. Margaret stood. "Emily Carter," she said. "Thank you for being here." "Thank you for the invitation," Emily said. She took the seat Stephen had indicated at the far end of the table, the presenter's position, with her folder in front of her and the presentation loaded on the screen at her right. She looked around the room. 7 faces. 7 people who held the authority to make decisions that would affect 1,700 employees, dozens of active projects, years of institutional relationships. 7 people who had received a 43-page report 11 days ago and had spent the time since asking the questions a competent board should ask when the ground beneath a company shifts. She said, "I want to be clear about what I'm here to do and what I'm not here to do. I'm not here as a witness against Richard Blackwell. I'm not here to prosecute the past. I'm here because I have specific knowledge of the operational and structural realities of this company that is relevant to the decisions you need to make, and I believe you should have that knowledge before you make them." Margaret said, "That's exactly why you're here." Emily opened her folder. She began. For the first 20 minutes, she presented the Harbor Project section. Methodically, factually, the Southeastern Parcel approval, the Coastal Amendment, the intersection that created the regulatory problem. She showed the documentation timeline not to establish blame, but to establish the pattern of how information had moved or failed to move within the company's decision structure. She showed the investors' disclosure record and the gap between what was known internally and what was disclosed externally. The board asked questions. Good questions, sharp ones, the kind of questions that came from people who had read the Crestline report carefully and had been thinking about it for 11 days. Emily answered every question directly and completely. At the 22-minute mark, one of the board members, a man named Gerald Hayes, no relation to Nathan, leaned forward and said, "Ms. Carter, the report identified the Southeastern Parcel issue and the disclosure gap. Those are real problems. But the conclusion of the report made a broader argument that those problems were symptomatic of a structural condition in how this company is governed. That conclusion is the one I want to understand better. Can you speak to that?" This was the moment. Emily had known this moment was coming and had been building toward it since she opened her folder. She said the structural condition the conclusion describes is this: for 20 years, Blackwell Holdings has operated in a model where all material risk information flows upward to one decision maker, is filtered through that decision maker's judgment, and is never subject to independent challenge before major commitments are made. That model works as long as the decision maker has perfect judgment and perfect information. No decision maker has either of those things. The Harbor Project is not an isolated failure. It's what happens when a system built on a single point of authority encounters a situation where that authority's blind spots are large enough to create real consequences. The room was quiet. Gerald said, "How do you know that's the model? How do you know that from inside the company?" Emily looked at him steadily. "Because I spent 10 years watching it operate from inside the building where the decisions were made at the table where they were discussed, and in the room where the consequences were managed, not as an employee, as the person who was considered too adjacent to be worth including and too present to be excluded. I was in the room. I was never of the room, which meant I watched everything without anyone managing what I saw." The room absorbed that. Margaret said quietly, "And what did you see?" Emily said. "I saw a man who is genuinely brilliant make decisions with confidence that consistently outpace the information available to support them. And I saw everyone around him accommodate that pattern because the consequences until now had been survivable. The Harbor Project is the first time the consequences became large enough that the pattern could not be absorbed quietly." She paused. "I also saw real strength," she said. "I want the board to hear that clearly. Richard Blackwell built something with genuine value. The relationships he has cultivated, the deals he has completed successfully. The company culture in its best expression, these are real. The problem is not Richard Blackwell. The problem is a system that has no mechanism for correcting Richard Blackwell when he is wrong." Margaret was looking at her with an expression that was the expression of someone hearing exactly what they needed to hear and recognizing it as such. Emily moved to the recommendations. She laid them out the same way she had described them to Richard on Tuesday. The COO with independent authority. The audit function reporting directly to the board. The 18-month governance review with an outside firm. She explained the reasoning behind each one, not as punishments for what had happened, but as structures that would have prevented what happened and would prevent the next version of it. When she finished, the room was quiet for nearly a full minute. Then Margaret said, "Thank you, Emily." And the questions began again. They lasted 45 minutes. Every board member spoke. Every question was substantive. Emily answered everything. She did not hedge. She did not soften the difficult parts. She did not overstate the damaging parts. She simply spoke the truth as completely as she knew it, with the specific kind of calm that comes from having carried something for a long time and finally being in the room where it belongs. When the questions ended, Margaret looked at her and said, "The board will need time to deliberate. We may have follow-up questions. Would you be willing to remain available this afternoon?" "Yes," Emily said. She gathered her folder. She stood. And then the thing happened that she had not planned for and had not expected, and that hit her with a force entirely disproportionate to its simplicity. Margaret Osei stood up. Then Gerald Hayes stood up. Then the second woman on the board, a quiet person named Diane Chow, who had not said more than 6 words during the presentation, but whose attention had been complete throughout, stood up. One by one, all 7 board members stood. Not applause, not ceremony, just 7 people getting to their feet at the same time. Margaret said, "What you've done here today, and what you built over the past 2 years to reach this moment took a kind of discipline and precision that this board has not often seen. I want you to know that it is recognized." Emily stood at the end of the table and held herself very still. She had not cried once in the 3 weeks since the divorce. Not in the courthouse, not in the hotel room, not during any of the phone calls. She had processed everything she felt in the way she processed everything internally precisely on her own time. She did not cry now. But something moved through her that was close to the feeling that precedes tears without becoming them. The feeling of being fully seen, not managed, not assessed, not categorized. Seen. "Thank you," she said. She walked out. In this corridor, Stephen Park was waiting. He looked at her face and seemed to understand that whatever had happened in the last hour and 45 minutes had gone the way it needed to go. "Coffee," he said. She actually laughed. A small, genuine, surprised laugh. "Yes," she said. "Please." They sat in the building's ground-floor cafe for 30 minutes while the board deliberated upstairs. Stephen did not ask her what had happened in the room. He talked instead about the company, about the projects he believed in, about the people on his team. He was worried about given the uncertainty of the past 2 weeks. He talked like a person who cared about his work and was frightened for it, and was grateful to be sitting across from someone who understood both things. Emily listened. At 11:47, her phone buzzed with a text from Margaret's assistant. "Board ready for follow-up, when you're available." She went back up. The follow-up lasted 20 minutes. 3 specific questions about the COO recommendation. The board wanted to understand the operational scope, the reporting structure, the relationship with the existing senior team. Emily answered them clearly and completely. When the final question was asked and answered, Margaret said, "The board will issue its formal decisions later today. I want to tell you informally that your recommendations have been received seriously and will be reflected in the outcome." Emily nodded. She left the building at 12:32 in the afternoon. Nathan was standing on the sidewalk outside exactly as he had said he would be. She walked out and he looked at her and she said, "It went well." He said, "I know, I can see it on your face." They stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cold November air, 2 people who had spent 18 months building something together, standing on the other side of it. "What now?" he said. She looked up the side of the building, 43 floors, the room where the conversation had finally happened. "Now," she said, "I go get my mother from Philadelphia, and I take her somewhere she's been wanting to go for years, and we stop talking about everything that happened, and we just be somewhere together." Nathan smiled. "And after that," she looked at him. "After that, I have approximately 40 women in various professional situations who have found my contact information through various channels in the past 3 months, all of whom are in some version of a room where nobody can see them. And I have something now that I didn't have before." "What's that?" he said. "Standing," she said. "A name, a story people know, and the specific knowledge of how to help someone turn what they see into something that changes the room they're in." Nathan looked at her steadily. "You're going to do this professionally?" "Yes," she said. "Corporate risk advising," he said. "Corporate risk advising," she confirmed. "And leadership consultation for women in organizations where the power structure doesn't reflect the intelligence available to it, which is most of them." I was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to be your first client." She looked at him surprised. "I have a firm," he said. "I have a governance structure that could use exactly the kind of review you just presented to that board. And I want the first official engagement of Emily Carter's consulting practice to be on the record with a contract and a fee and everything that goes with it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Nathan," she said. "Name your rate," he said. She told him. He did not flinch. "Deal," he said. They shook hands on the sidewalk outside Blackwell Holdings. The board's formal decisions were issued at 4:30 that afternoon by written notice to all relevant parties. Emily read hers in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the hotel. The harbor project would proceed under a modified timeline pending resolution of the southeastern parcel approval, for which Blackwell Holdings would file a voluntary revised application within 30 days. The SEC inquiry would be met with full voluntary disclosure to be filed within 10 business days. A COO search would be initiated with a mandate for independent operational authority. An audit committee reporting structure would be reorganized to report directly to the board chair. A governance review process with a third-party firm would be established and conducted within the next 12 months. And one more item, Richard Blackwell would retain his position as CEO with full board confidence subject to the new governance framework. Emily read that last line twice. She had recommended it. She had meant it when she said it. But reading it in the formal board document, seeing it made official, she felt something that surprised her. Not relief that he had been protected. Not satisfaction that her recommendation had been followed. Something quieter. Something that felt like the specific kind of peace that comes when you act from your own values rather than from your wounds, and the outcome reflects that. She had done the right thing. Not the satisfying thing. The right thing. She set her phone face down on the table and finished her coffee. Richard called at 5:15. She almost did not answer. Not because she did not want to talk to him, but because she was not yet sure what kind of conversation this was going to be, and she had learned over the past 3 weeks that some conversations needed to be approached from a very specific internal state, and she wanted to make sure she was in it. She answered on the third ring. He said, "They told me." "I know," she said. "You recommended they keep me," he said. His voice had a quality she had not heard in it before. Not gratitude exactly, not relief, something more complicated. The voice of a man who has been handed something he does not feel he deserved and is in the process of figuring out what to do with that. "I recommended what the company needs," she said. "Emily." He stopped, started again. "What you did in there today, what you built to get there, what you chose to do with it." He stopped again. "I don't have the right words for this." She waited. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the accounts, for the courthouse, for the 10 years before it, for every moment I looked at you and put you in a category instead of seeing who you were." A pause. "I know that's not enough. I know sorry doesn't give you those years back, but I need you to hear it. From me. Directly." Emily held the phone. She thought about this version of herself who had walked into that courthouse 3 weeks ago in a gray mid-range suit and stood still while her accounts disappeared from her phone screen. She thought about the hotel room, the calls with Nathan, the nights she had spent going through documentation at a desk facing a wall, the 2 years before that, and the 6 years before that, and the decade that contained all of it. She thought about her mother's voice. "You're ready. You've always been ready." She thought about what it cost to carry something that long and what it gave you in return. "I hear it," she said. "I believe you mean it." "But," he said. "No, but," she said. "I just hear it, and I'm choosing to believe you mean it, because that's the version of this that lets both of us move forward." He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "What are you going to do now?" "I'm going to build something," she said. "What kind of something?" "The kind that helps people who've been in the rooms I've been in figure out what they know and what to do with it," she said. "The kind that takes the education I got from being invisible and turns it into something useful for people who are still in that situation." He was quiet again. Then he said, "That's going to be remarkable." She almost said thank you. Instead, she said, "I know." And that was the truest thing she had said in the entire conversation, because it was not arrogance. It was simply recognition. She knew what she was capable of. She had always known. She had spent a decade in a room that didn't know it, and she was done adjusting herself to what rooms believed about her. The call ended. Emily put her phone in her bag. She left the coffee shop. She walked 2 blocks to the hotel and went upstairs and looked at the room she had been living in for 3 weeks. The desk, the single chair, the window facing the wall, and she felt a clear and specific gratitude for it. It had been the right space for the work that needed doing. Small, private, unobserved. A room where nobody was watching, which was exactly the kind of room where she did her best thinking. But she did not need it anymore. She called the front desk and told them she would be checking out Friday morning. Then she called her mother. Jean answered on the first ring. "How did it go?" Jean said. "It went exactly the way it was supposed to go," Emily said. Jean was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you all right? Really all right?" Emily thought about that question. The same question her mother had asked the night the divorce was finalized. The same question she had answered then with fine and managing it. And the other words people use when they are carrying something they are not ready to fully name. She did not use those words now. "Yes," she said. "I'm really all right. For the first time in a long time, I think I'm actually all right." She heard her mother exhale. "Come home," Jean said. "Tomorrow," Emily said. "I'll be there by noon." She hung up. She sat on the edge of the bed in the small hotel room that had held her through the most consequential 3 weeks of her life, and she let herself feel the full weight of everything at once, not managing it, not processing it in careful increments, just feeling it, the exhaustion underneath the clarity, the grief for the years that had been spent in a particular kind of invisibility, the pride quiet and solid in what she had built and how she had used it, the relief that it was done, the anticipation of what came next. 6 months later, Emily Carter stood on a stage in Chicago. The conference was called the National Leadership Forum for Women in Business. 1,400 people in the audience, 3 screens carrying her face to the back of the room. The kind of stage that would have seemed impossible to her 3 years ago. Not because she couldn't have stood on it, but because she had been so occupied with being in the room where nobody saw her that she had not thought to imagine the room where everyone would. She had spent those 6 months building what she told Nathan she would build. A consulting practice with her name on it. A roster of 12 clients in the first 6 months, mostly women in senior organizational roles. Some at the early stages of understanding what they knew. Some at the point of needing to act on it, all of them, in some version of the situation she had lived. Nathan Hayes was her anchor client and her most vocal advocate. He had referred 4 of the 12 to her personally. She had moved out of the hotel the Friday after the board meeting and into an apartment in Brooklyn, the kind of apartment that was entirely hers, with furniture she had chosen herself, and no room that was off limits, and no performance required to exist within it. She had driven to Philadelphia the following Saturday and taken her mother to the ocean, which Jean had been wanting to do for 2 years, and they had sat on the beach in winter coats with takeout coffee and talked for 4 hours about everything and nothing, and Emily had cried for the first time since before the divorce, sitting next to her mother with the sound of waves behind them. Not from sadness exactly, but from the specific release of having been through something immense and come out the other side of it still whole. Blackwell Holdings had filed its voluntary SEC disclosure 8 days after the board meeting. The Harbor Project's southeastern parcel application was in review. The COO search had produced a hire by February, a woman named Diana Reyes, who had run operations for a mid-sized infrastructure firm in Texas, and who by all accounts Emily had heard through Nathan was excellent and was already changing the way information moved within the company. The audit restructuring was complete. The 18-month governance review was scheduled. Richard had sent Emily a single text message in March. It said, "Diana Reyes started this week. You were right about everything. I'm still figuring out what to do with that." Emily had replied, "That's the right thing to be doing with it." He had not written again. She did not expect him to. But the exchange had felt like a door being closed gently rather than locked. On the Chicago stage, Emily looked out at the 1,400 people in front of her. She thought about what she wanted to say, not the prepared remarks she had written and refined over 3 weeks, which were good and which she would give. The thing underneath those remarks. The thing she had not said out loud to a room full of people before. She said it. "I spent 10 years in a room where nobody could see me, not because I was hidden, because the people in the room had decided before I ever walked in what I was and what I was capable of. And I accepted that for longer than I should have, because I thought the cost of fighting it was higher than the cost of living inside it. I was wrong about that. The cost of staying invisible is not lower than the cost of being seen. It is simply different. And what I did not understand until I had paid both of them is that the cost of being seen is finite. You pay it once. And what you get on the other side of it is yours permanently. Nobody can freeze it. Nobody can cancel it. Nobody can take it from you in a courthouse on a November morning while you stand there and look at your phone." The room was completely quiet. "What they took from me," she said, "was never my most valuable possession. The most valuable things I owned were never stored anywhere a person could access or freeze or cancel or redirect. They were mine in the way that nothing else can be mine. They were built from everything I had watched and learned and carried and waited, and finally, when the moment was exactly right, used." She looked out at the audience. "Never confuse someone's silence for surrender," she said. "Never mistake someone's patience for passivity. Never look at the quiet person in the room and decide they have nothing to say, because the quiet person in the room is often the one who understands the room most completely. They're just waiting for the moment when what they understand can be used to change it." She paused. "And if you are that person, if you are sitting in a room right now where nobody sees you, I want you to hear this directly. The room is not the final verdict on who you are. The room is just where you're standing right now. and who you are is larger than any room that has ever tried to contain you." The silence lasted for 3 full seconds after she finished. Then the room erupted. Emily stood at the microphone and let it wash over her, not in the way she might have once with the careful composure of a woman managing her public expression, but fully, openly. The way a person receives recognition when they have stopped being afraid of what it means to be seen. Afterward, in the green room, 15 women came to find her. Different ages, different industries, different versions of the same situation she had described from the stage. She spoke to each of them. She listened to what they were carrying. She gave each of them something concrete, a question, a framework, a piece of understanding that she had won from experience and was no longer keeping to herself. The last woman was young, mid-20s, working in finance, she said, in a company where she knew things that weren't being listened to. She said, "How do you know when the moment is right to act, to use what you know?" Emily looked at her. She thought about a Tuesday morning 6 years ago. She thought about a hotel room with a desk facing a wall. She thought about the moment she walked out of a courthouse with one suitcase and chose to look defeated because she already knew something Richard did not know. She said, "You know when the cost of staying quiet is higher than the cost of telling the truth. And when you feel that clearly, completely, without any remaining doubt, that's your moment." The young woman looked at her with the specific expression of someone receiving something they have needed for a long time. Emily said, "And when it comes, don't hesitate. You'll be ready. You've been getting ready longer than you know." She said goodbye. She walked out of the green room and through the conference center and out into the Chicago night. She breathed in the cold air. She thought about everything that had brought her to this sidewalk on this night in this city as this person. She thought about Richard somewhere in New York, learning what it meant to be in a room where his judgment was not the only one. She thought about her mother in Philadelphia, living in a house that was hers and stable, and not connected to anything that could be frozen or canceled by someone else's phone. She thought about Nathan, who had looked at her across a table at a charity dinner 12 years ago and asked her a real question and listened to the real answer. She thought about the young woman in the green room who was somewhere in her own hotel room tonight, thinking about what it meant to know when the moment was right. And she thought about the version of herself who had stood in a courthouse 3 weeks after that charity dinner and felt for the first time the specific quality of clarity that comes when you finally understand what you have been building and why and how close you are to being ready to use it. She had been right about that feeling. Clarity, it turned out, was not a destination. It was a practice. And Emily Carter had been practicing it her entire life. She started walking, not toward anything in particular, just forward, the way a woman walks who knows exactly who she is, where she has been, and what she is capable of, and who has finally completely and permanently stopped waiting for someone else's permission to take up space in her own story.